It started like any other summer afternoon in the small wooded town of Alder Creek. Families were out for barbecues, kids rode their bikes across the gravel streets, and the dense emerald forest behind the Shaw residence hummed with the soft buzz of insects and birds. 13-year-old Emily Shaw had always been drawn to that forest. It was a place her mother warned her about, not because of real danger, but because of the stories people like to tell. Stories of disappearances, whispers about cursed trees, shadows moving in the twilight. Emily had never believed them. She was a curious, independent child, the kind who carried a small notebook in her backpack and wrote down what she called important discoveries. On that particular afternoon, her brother Liam, 3 years older, had dared her to do something she had hesitated about for weeks. Walk past the Hunter's Rock, a mossy landmark at the edge of the woods where most kids dared not go. They were sitting on their porch when he said it, with that smirk he always wore when teasing her. She rolled her eyes, grabbed her notebook, and said she'd be back before dinner. No one knew those would be her last words heard in person. Emily disappeared somewhere between the clearing and the creek. It wasn't until the sun began to slip behind the trees that her mother noticed how long she'd been gone. Her calls went unanswered. Liam, suddenly pale, confessed to daring her into the forest. A frantic search began, first by family and neighbors, then by police and trained dogs. Flashlights bounced across the woods, helicopters flew low, volunteers combed every trail, but nothing turned up. No footprints past the creek, no torn clothing, only her red scarf, knotted around a thorn bush near Hunter's Rock, as if she had dropped it there on purpose. The woods swallowed her whole, and no one could say how or why. The town responded the way small towns do. There were vigils, prayer circles, missing posters taped to telephone poles that curled at the corners after the first rain. People left flowers at the edge of the forest, near the place where her scarf was found. But whispers spread quickly. Some said she was taken by someone lurking in the woods. Others claimed she was cursed, that it was the forest itself that wanted her. What made it worse was the pattern that began to emerge when an old woman, June Caraway, came forward. She told police and reporters that Emily wasn't the first girl to vanish in those woods. She said 2 others had gone missing before her, one in 1970 and another in 1980, always in the summer, always near the forest's edge. No one had believed her before, but now they listened. Emily's father stopped speaking much after that. He sat in the living room with the TV on, but never watching. Her mother spent hours walking the forest edge, calling her name long after it made sense. Liam changed too. He went from joking and carefree to silent and withdrawn. He blamed himself, and rightly so, at least in his own mind. He was the last one to speak to her. He dared her to go. That kind of guilt doesn't go away. As the weeks stretched into months, the Shaws tried to return to normal. But a home with a missing child never becomes normal again. They left her room untouched. Her drawings stayed taped to the wall. Her backpack, with its missing notebook, remained by the door. When the anniversary of her disappearance came, the town held a memorial. Her family lit candles, local news cameras filmed the tearful ceremony, and a local pastor spoke about hope and faith. But even then, even among prayers and soft music, no one could shake the feeling that something darker lay just beneath the surface. No suspect had been arrested, no new evidence had appeared. It was as if she had walked into another dimension, erased from the world with surgical precision. Liam began to retreat from the town altogether. He took up flying drones, partly for distraction, partly out of obsession. He said it gave him a bird's-eye view of the world, a perspective that might catch what everyone else missed. At first, his parents thought it was just a hobby, but they didn't know how many hours he spent flying over that forest, mapping every inch, tracking changes in the tree line, noting down where vegetation shifted after storms. He wasn't just looking for closure, he was looking for her. Over the years, the story faded from headlines, but never from Alder Creek. Families still warned their kids about the forest. Hunters told stories around fires. And behind it all, the question remained: what happened to Emily Shaw? She wasn't a troubled girl. She had friends, good grades, and dreams of becoming a wildlife photographer. She loved animals, especially birds, and had once spent 2 weeks trying to teach a crow to recognize her voice. She was creative, bright, and stubborn in the way only someone on the edge of adolescence can be, And now she was a myth in her own hometown, a girl who walked into the woods and never came back. But myths have roots, and sometimes the truth is more terrifying than the legend. The morning after Emily disappeared, Alder Creek changed. The neighborhood that once echoed with the laughter of children and weekend yard work fell into a strange hush. By sunrise, officers in khaki uniforms had begun lining up search teams across the trailheads. Orange flags were placed along routes, while trained dogs moved quickly through the bramble, noses close to the ground, tugging their handlers deeper into the woods. The Shaw family watched from the edge of the backyard, eyes scanning the horizon as if Emily might simply appear, sheepish and tired, emerging from the shadows with an excuse. But the hours passed, then the days, and the search became more structured, more desperate, more ritual than rescue. The forest, once a playground for neighborhood kids, now loomed as a silent and sinister wall of secrets. Liam tried to retrace her steps on the first day, his sneakers caked in mud as he pushed past low branches and crunched dry leaves. He remembered exactly where they sat on the porch, how she looked when she turned and said she would go, how his heart pounded after she disappeared into the trees. That night, as the last of the volunteers were called back, Liam sat alone under a floodlight near Hunter's Rock. He stared at the ground where her scarf had been found, whispering her name under his breath, as if the trees could answer. A search dog had circled that spot 3 times earlier, each loop more frantic than the last, before sitting and refusing to move. It was as if the scent had vanished mid-air, like Emily had taken one step too far and been plucked from the earth. Over the following week, law enforcement expanded the perimeter. They brought in thermal imaging equipment, underwater cameras for the nearby creek, and even a helicopter equipped with infrared. Every search ended the same. No footprints, no clothing, no blood, no signs of struggle. At a press conference held in the school gymnasium, the sheriff spoke in a tired voice about community resilience and continued efforts, while Emily's mother sat frozen in the front row, holding the strap of her missing daughter's backpack. Afterward, rumors started spreading. Some believed a hunter had taken her and buried the evidence. Others said the forest had always had a mind of its own, and what it claimed it never returned. The town's librarian, a woman named Helen Dorsey, uncovered a local news clipping from 1980 about a girl named Karina Holloway who had vanished near the same woods. The similarity was chilling. Karina was 13, last seen heading into the forest alone to gather pine cones for a school art project. Her backpack was found near the same moss-covered rock. 10 years before that, in 1970, another case from the same region involved a 12-year-old girl named April Boone who disappeared while on a family hike. The trail map found in her pocket had an X drawn exactly where Emily's scarf was discovered. The authorities had never linked the cases before, but now, with a third girl gone, the town began to whisper about a pattern. Some called it a coincidence. Others said there were too many details that overlapped to be ignored. 3 girls, 10 years apart, same age, same stretch of forest. Each disappearance during the warmest part of summer. Liam spent most of that month avoiding people. At first, it was guilt. Then it turned into obsession. He read everything he could about the forest, local legends, plant behavior, animal migration, and even seismic activity. When nothing made sense, he began creating his own maps. On the back of his school notebooks, he sketched grids and zones, marking where search teams had gone and where they hadn't. He started using his allowance to rent time on a public drone from the hardware store, learning to fly it by watching online tutorials. He told no one, not even his parents. At first, he used it to scan the backyard and treetops. Then slowly he began sending it deeper, cataloging the forest from above in small sections. He was convinced there was something there, something that human eyes were missing. His father said it was his way of coping, and the town psychiatrist gave him a quiet nod of approval when he mentioned it, but Liam didn't want approval. He wanted facts. He wanted answers. And most of all, he wanted his sister back. As the 1-year anniversary approached, the case was still classified as a missing person. No leads, no arrests, no evidence of foul play. A single red scarf, some faded drawings from an abandoned cabin, and stories about a strange man seen watching from the ranger tower the day Emily went missing. The man had never been identified. The ranger on duty claimed he saw someone in a dark jacket standing just past the forest line near the entrance. But when officers arrived, There was no one there. The camera footage had been too blurry to make out a face, and most people assumed it was just a hiker. But Liam remembered the way the ranger paused when telling the story, the uncertainty in his voice, as if he doubted what he saw himself. Emily's mother stopped going to church. She no longer answered calls from friends. Her father sold his landscaping truck and spent most afternoons in the backyard, staring into the woods with the look of a man who had already buried something he loved. The forest became a quiet adversary. Trees, once climbed by children, now stood as prison bars, keeping whatever secret they held locked deep beneath their canopy. The local school began, including Emily's case in its annual safety assembly, showing a slideshow with her face and a quote from her diary. Some students whispered that her ghost haunted the creek after sundown. Others claimed she had run away and was living in the hills, watching from the shadows. No one knew the truth, but everyone had a version of it. Late one night, when the power went out in Alder Creek due to a summer storm, Liam stood at the edge of the trees with his drone controller in hand. He watched the blinking light disappear above the treetops, eyes fixed on the screen as he guided it farther than before. The drone tilted toward a clearing he hadn't seen, one that didn't show on any town map. A flicker caught his eye, something metallic reflecting light from the moon. But before he could adjust the camera, the feed cut out. The screen went black. He ran inside, heart racing, already planning to search that grid again the next day. Somewhere, deep in the forest, something was waiting. And Liam was no longer just searching, he was hunting. The summer after the failed search shifted the town into a strange rhythm of silent acknowledgement and avoidance. By the second anniversary of Emily's disappearance, Alder Creek no longer spoke her name in public, but her presence lingered like smoke. Parents clutched their children's hands tighter near the forest, and teens dared each other to step past Hunter's Rock, but never actually did. The police files had long since been boxed up and moved to cold case storage, and official efforts had ended with a brief press release and a photograph of Emily hung at the county sheriff's office beside two faded photos of girls from decades prior. Liam, now 16, had continued his drone flights, quietly, conveniently, documenting every quadrant of the woods from the air. He built a crude control center in the attic of their home using borrowed parts and a second-hand laptop, where he analyzed footage frame by frame at night while the rest of the house slept. He no longer spoke much to his parents, who had grown too tired for arguments and too numb for hope. Liam's eyes rarely left the screen except to mark coordinates in a spiral-bound notebook already filled with maps, measurements, and hand. His drone had caught strange shifts in tree patterns near the northern edge of the forest. Large branches, once bent toward the east, now tilted westward, as if repositioned. In a flight over an unusually dark patch of trees, the camera lens had momentarily picked up something pale resting beside a hollowed log. When he returned to investigate with a flashlight and GPS, he found nothing except a rotted log and an unusual silence. No birds, no wind, no insects. Just the sound of his own breath and a feeling he couldn't name. One evening in mid-July, he visited the Alder Creek Historical Society after overhearing at the grocery store that the older woman who once warned about the forest had left her belongings behind after passing away the previous winter. Her name was June Caraway, and her house had been donated to the town, its contents marked for sorting and sale. Inside a box labeled Local Myths, Liam found a leather-bound journal with brittle pages filled with shaky cursive. She had written extensively about the forest, not in stories, but in descriptions. Places where the light bent wrong, spots where compasses failed, times when birds stopped chirping for hours. One passage described a summer in 1980 when she saw a girl in a yellow dress standing motionless on the path near Hunter's Rock. June had called out, but the girl never turned. By the time she reached the trail, the girl had vanished. She believed something in the forest was choosing, something intelligent. Not a spirit, not a person, something else. She had mapped the disappearances and even claimed the forest grew in cycles. Every 10 years, the trees thinned in one area and thickened in another, like it was breathing. Liam traced the pattern in her notes and overlaid it onto his own maps. The forest did shift in ways that were hard to explain. Satellite images from past decades confirmed it. Trails swallowed new gaps appearing, vegetation changing at rates that defied simple biology. He visited the town library and cross-referenced missing persons reports going back to the 1950. What he found stunned him. There were more than just the 3 known cases. A boy in 1960, a hiker in 1991, a young woman in 2001 walking her dog, all presumed lost, accidents or animals blamed, none with a clear conclusion. And every one of them near Alder Creek or its surrounding trails. Some had been filed in neighboring jurisdictions, disconnected and forgotten. The sheriff had never acknowledged a link between them, but the pattern was undeniable. Something had always been wrong with those woods. Word spread after Liam spoke with a retired ranger named Marlin, who had worked the area for over 30 years. Marlin remembered unusual orders from higher-ups after the 1980 disappearances. Search areas were deliberately limited. Equipment was pulled after 2 days. Volunteers were told to stay away from the northwest ridge. Marlin had always thought it was bureaucratic caution, but now he confessed he had seen something himself in 1982, a large unnatural shape in the trees that shimmered for a moment and then vanished. He refused to describe it further, but warned Liam to stop looking. That night, Liam returned home and stared at the old map of the forest, now covered in red dots marking disappearances. The map resembled a clock. Every 10 years, the dots circled back to the same section of woods. He traced the outline of an irregular clearing near the center of the pattern. He had flown over it once, but the footage had glitched. The image shook violently for 2 seconds, then returned to normal. He had dismissed it as a hardware issue. Now he wondered. Liam knew his parents would never agree to another search. They had stopped hoping and started coping. His mother volunteered at the local animal shelter and kept herself busy feeding strays. His father started working at the hardware store part-time to avoid being alone in the house. They rarely spoke about Emily anymore, and Liam never brought it up. That silence was heavier than words. He packed his drone, notebook, a flashlight, and a small camping shovel. He told himself he wasn't going into the forest that night, just checking the perimeter of the clearing and launching from a closer distance. As he reached the boundary near the old ranger tower, he saw that the path was partially cleared, as if someone had walked it recently. Leaves disturbed, twigs snapped clean. The tower itself was rusting and half consumped, but it still overlooked the area near the glitch point. Liam climbed halfway up and set the drone on the platform. The air was still and damp. He launched it and watched the live feed as the drone moved toward the clearing. Just as it reached the center, the camera froze, then flickered, then displayed a single frame that chilled Liam to the bone. It showed what appeared to be a girl standing at the edge of the clearing. She wore something light-colored. Her face was obscured by the angle, but her arms were at her sides and her feet pointed forward. Before he could capture a screenshot, the feed went black. He retrieved the drone and walked the first few feet into the forest, stopping when he saw the base of a tree marked with something carved deep into the bark, the initials ES. Liam reached out to touch it, but stopped. Something felt wrong. Not just dangerous, intentional, like the forest knew he had arrived. He backed away and left quickly, the hairs on his neck raised all the way back to the trailhead. That night, he stayed up replaying the frozen frame in his mind, drawing the shape of the girl again and again in his notebook, searching for a clue he might have missed. By the time Liam turned 17, his attic room had transformed from a teenager's hideaway into something closer to an evidence war room. The walls were covered in aerial photographs, maps with red threads connecting specific locations, newspaper clippings pinned beside faded school portraits of the missing girls, and detailed sketches of forest clearings and tree formations. His obsession had grown from late-night curiosity into a full-time compulsion. He barely spoke during meals and often forgot to eat entirely, sustaining himself on cold leftovers and caffeine pills when he needed to stay up analyzing footage. Every weekend was a new flight, and each drone launch was accompanied by the same feeling in his chest, the quiet belief that this next one would be different, that this time he would find what the world had missed for decades. He no longer told anyone about the footage. His parents had stopped asking questions long ago, and the few friends he once had drifted away, unable to keep up with the slow unraveling of his thoughts. His only consistent company was the buzz of propellers and the blinking red lights on his equipment as the drones took off toward a forest that seemed to change every time he looked at it. from the glitch frame from his last flight, the figure that appeared to be standing at the edge of the clearing had imprinted itself on his mind. He could still see it when he closed his eyes. Every angle of her posture, the tilt of her head, the light-colored fabric that looked so much like the shirt Emily wore the day she vanished. He had gone back to the exact spot on foot the following morning, walking slowly along the path with his heart pounding in his ears. The bark of the tree, marked with her initials, had grown slightly since he had first seen it, the edges of the carving dark with age and weathering. But something else was new. Around the base of the tree, the leaves and moss had been disturbed, a small circle of flattened ground, as if someone had stood there recently. He bent down, brushing away debris, and found something wedged between two roots, a button. Round, plastic, pale blue. It looked like it had been torn from a shirt. He held it in his hand for a long time before placing it into a sealed bag and storing it in the metal box under his bed. The following days blurred together. He pored over years of forest growth data, studying tree rings and environmental studies, searching for any pattern that would explain the shifting landscape. He contacted old surveyors and forestry experts online, posing as a university student doing research. Most never responded, but one man did. He sent Liam a set of files from the early 1990s, showing proposed logging maps for Alder Creek. One plan had been canceled because workers reported abnormal terrain instability near the center ridge, right around the same area where the drone glitch had occurred. In the margin of the document, someone had written a note in pencil. Leave that patch alone. He could not explain why, but it gave him the same chill as the photo frame of the girl. He wondered who had written it and whether they had known what the forest was hiding. He started to experiment with flight routes. Instead of broad surveys, he focused on narrow paths, mimicking the way someone might walk through the trees. He flew the drones low, just above eye level, moving slowly and silently between trunks. The camera captured more than he expected. A rusted lantern hanging from a branch, scraps of fabric tangled in bramble, carvings in bark that formed partial symbols. One day, while analyzing footage from a southern route, the drone passed over what looked like an unnatural mound of earth, rectangular in shape, covered in moss. He paused the footage and zoomed in. The edges were too straight, too clean. He returned on foot the next day, measuring the location by GPS. What he found was not just a mound, it was a hatch. Metal, rusted, half-buried, no larger than a cellar door. He knelt beside it, brushing away dirt, and found a set of numbers engraved faintly into the surface. 35, 70. Liam froze. Those were the same numbers written at the bottom of a page in June Carraway's journal, circled twice, with no explanation. He tried to lift the hatch, but it was sealed shut, either from rust or something more deliberate. He marked the spot and returned home in silence. That night, Liam opened a folder he had not touched in over a year. Inside were pages from Emily's old notebook. She had taken it on every hike and used it to write observations about birds and insects. On the last page, written in small, neat handwriting, was a list of things she wanted to explore that summer. One entry read Cave near Hunter's Rock entrance. Liam had never noticed it before. He scanned his maps again. There were no caves listed, but the coordinates from the hatch aligned with that same region. He began to form a theory, one so fragile and wild he barely let himself consider it. What if Emily had found something that day? What if the forest had not taken her, but she had followed something underground? He began assembling a new drone. This one was built for terrain, smaller, equipped with infrared, designed to slip into narrow spaces. He spent 2 weeks assembling it in secret, ordering parts online under a fake name, paying in cash. He tested it at night in the alley behind his house, tweaking the camera until it responded to low light. Every detail mattered. He was not just searching anymore, he was preparing for discovery, and something in the pit of his stomach told him time was running out. 3 nights later, Liam returned to the hatch just before dawn. The forest was unnaturally quiet. No birds, no wind, the air was heavy and still. He placed the terrain drone on the moss and activated it. The small machine moved slowly across the ground, approaching the metal hatch. He had affixed a claw arm to it and tried the latch. The dash cam. The hatch shifted slightly. A gust of stale, damp air hissed upward, curling into the trees like breath. Liam watched as the camera descended the first few feet, showing stone steps leading downward into a dark chamber. He pulled the drone back immediately. His hands were shaking. He backed away from the hatch, breathing fast, and packed up his gear. He knew now that something was buried beneath Alder Creek, and for the first time in years, he was certain Emily had been down there. Liam stayed awake that entire night, watching and re-watching the footage from the terrain drone, his fingers trembling every time he paused the frame that showed the stone staircase descending into the darkness beneath the hatch. He noticed details he had missed the first time around, like the unusual shape of the stones, which looked hand-cut and fitted without mortar, or the faint scratches on the wall just beyond the threshold, vertical markings that seemed too deliberate to be natural erosion. He replayed the moment the stale air escaped when the hatch cracked open, trying to determine if any sound accompanied it. But the drone had no audio. Still, Liam was sure he had felt something shift, not just in the air, but in the silence that followed. It was as if the forest itself had exhaled after holding its breath for too long. For years he had chased shadows through treetops and overgrown trails, but now the mystery had changed direction. The answer was not hidden in the canopy or tangled in the underbrush. It was below, underground, buried not by time, but by choice. And if Emily had been pulled into that darkness, then whatever lived in those tunnels had either taken her or she had followed it willingly. Over the next few days, Liam focused on mapping the area surrounding the hatch with greater precision. He used the aerial drone to scan for surface disturbances, measuring soil compaction, vegetation inconsistencies, and temperature gradients. He flew at different times of the day and under different weather conditions, searching for subtle clues. At first, the data was chaotic, the variations too scattered to form patterns. But then he noticed something that made his skin crawl. Every time he flew over the area within a 50-foot radius of the hatch, the drone's GPS would briefly cut out. It happened without fail, usually for 3 to 5 seconds, enough to cause a momentary glitch in the footage. This blackout zone did not exist anywhere else in the forest, and Liam had flown over nearly every square inch of Alder Creek's tree canopy. He cross-referenced the blackout spots with older satellite images from public records and found something that made his heart pound. The tree coverage in that area had remained strangely consistent for the past 30 years, while the surrounding forest showed the normal signs of growth, clearing, and seasonal change. It was as if the land above the hatch was frozen in place, refusing to shift or decay like the rest of the world. Liam expanded his operation. He modified the terrain drone again, adding a stronger light source and a longer lurching battery. He included a pressure sensor and proximity alert, tools that would warn him of sudden temperature drops or narrow passages. He also brought a new item into the mix, a soil sampler. If the earth beneath that zone was chemically different, he wanted to know. One clear morning, just after the dew had dried on the leaves, he returned to the hatch and deployed the drone again. This time, he let it descend 3 steps further. The light cut through the darkness, revealing walls that had been reinforced with wood beams, most of them old and splintered but still intact. A few had symbols carved into them, not words but shapes, repeating triangles, circles intersecting with lines. His hands gripped the control tighter as the drone turned a corner and illuminated a narrow corridor stretching deeper into the earth. Along the wall were hooks, and hanging from them were tattered pieces of fabric, possibly coats or cloaks. There was something ritualistic about the arrangement, something too structured to be random. Liam noted every timestamp, every angle, and pulled the drone back before it lost signal. When he retrieved it, he sat on the forest floor for several minutes, staring at the trees, listening. There were still no birds. At home, he created a digital archive of everything the drone had recorded. He isolated frames, enhanced shadows, and compared the markings on the walls with ancient runes from online databases. Some of them matched old pagan symbols, though not perfectly. There were similarities to protection signs used by certain lost tribes in Europe, symbols meant to ward off spirits or seal dangerous places. The more he read, the more disturbed he became. These tunnels were not accidental. They were not natural formations. Someone had carved them, reinforced them, decorated them, and hidden them, and then sealed them again and again. Liam suspected the group responsible had once used the hatch regularly, but now the silence felt final. Whatever was down there had been left undisturbed for years, until his drone cracked the lid. He feared what his curiosity had awakened. The following evening, Liam noticed another change. As he reviewed the GPS data from the drone flights, he saw something unexpected. A new heat signature had appeared in the aerial scans, barely visible but clearly different from the cold background of the forest floor. It was located less than 10 yards from the hatch, tucked beneath the thickest part of the canopy. He had never seen it before. At first, he thought it was a calibration error, but the reading was consistent across 2 different flights, taken 12 hours apart. Something was generating heat beneath the ground, a steady warmth that did not change with the air temperature. Liam programmed a longer drone flight for the next morning, this time focusing entirely on that zone. The drone rose just after sunrise, its camera aimed downward in slow sweeping arcs. As it passed over the coordinates, the heat signature intensified. The thermal camera displayed it in bright orange, revealing a rectangular shape embedded into the forest floor. Liam realized with a sharp intake of breath that it matched the dimensions of a large room. It was not a rock formation, it was not natural, it was constructed, and it was active. He hovered the drone for a full minute, adjusting the angles and confirming the readings. Then, just before he prepared to pull back, the heat signature pulsed. It grew brighter for 2 seconds, then dimmed. A rhythmic beat, faint but precise. Liam stared at the screen, unsure if he was seeing what he thought he was. It looked like a heartbeat. Slow, heavy, consistent. Not an animal. Not a simple heat source. Something controlled. Something sleeping. Or worse, something waiting. He guided the drone upward and flew it home in silence. He knew now without question that he was being drawn closer for a reason. The forest was no longer just a puzzle. It was a trap, and he had walked willingly into its jaws. But he was no longer afraid. He had spent too many years living in the shadow of that silence, haunted by the absence of his sister and the blank spaces in the story no one had dared to finish. He would go further. He would find the truth. And whatever waited underground, it would no longer remain hidden. Liam spent the next 48 hours assembling everything he needed with the single-minded focus of someone who no longer feared the unknown, but had accepted its presence as a fact of his reality. His mind replayed the slow-pulsing heat signature from the drone footage like a warning bell buried inside his chest. He had studied every frame, measured every fluctuation in the light, timed every delay in the heartbeat-like rhythm. Whatever lay beneath the forest floor was real and deliberate, and now that he had seen it, he could not allow himself to step back. There was no option left but forward. The metal hatch was no longer a puzzle to be analyzed from a distance. It was a doorway, and he had already opened it. He packed his bag with supplies he had quietly collected over the past few months. A high-powered flashlight, a headlamp, extra batteries, protein bars, bottled water, chalk, gloves, rope, a folding ladder, a gas meter, and a small handheld video recorder with infrared capability. He told no one what he was doing. He left a note on his desk in case something went wrong, not with an explanation, but with a single sentence written in his sister's handwriting, copied from the back page of her old notebook. "I want to find what no one else sees." The sun was just starting to rise as Liam reached the hatch. The forest around him was shrouded in a thick layer of mist, making the trees appear like giant pillars fading into the sky. The silence pressed against him from all sides. No birds, no wind. The same unnatural stillness he had felt each time he approached this place, now stronger than ever. He removed the moss and debris from the hatch, placed the ladder carefully inside, and climbed down slowly, one step at a time, testing the weight of each rung as he descended into the earth. The stone steps were damp and cold, their surfaces worn smooth by years of contact. His flashlight swept across the walls as he moved deeper. The carvings were clearer now, symbols repeated along the corridor, etched into the wood beams and stone alike. The narrow passage turned sharply to the left and opened into a chamber no larger than a school classroom. The walls were lined with wooden frames, each one supporting a different object. Some held faded scraps of fabric or leather, others held bones or feathers or metal shards that looked hand-forged. Everything was organized with care, as if placed for observation or ritual. In the center of the room stood a small table made from dark wood, cracked with age, but still intact. On the table was a single object, a notebook. He approached it slowly, heart pounding. The cover was torn and stained, but he recognized the handwriting instantly. It was Emily's, the same looping letters, the same symbols she had drawn in her old-school notebooks. He opened it and scanned the pages, each one filled with notes and sketches, descriptions of underground passages, drawings of rooms, lists of names, some crossed out. One page showed a rough map with an arrow pointing to a spot labeled Upper Chamber. Beside it were the words, "Still breathing." Liam stared at the phrase, unable to look away. His hand gripped the notebook tighter. She had been down here, not just for minutes, not just by accident. She had lived down here long enough to write, to document, to explore. And something had been breathing when she wrote it. He took a deep breath and moved deeper into the tunnels. The air grew thicker the further he went, forcing him to move slower, to breathe through his mouth. The gas meter in his hand blinked green, showing low risk for carbon dioxide, but picking up faint traces of methane. The tunnel floor began to slope downward at a shallow angle, leading him to a second corridor lined with more of the same wooden beam. This hallway ended in a wooden door slightly ajar, its hinges warped from moisture. He pushed it open carefully and stepped into a room larger than the last. This one had beds, small wooden frames, each with a thin blanket, some folded neatly, others left crumpled as if abandoned in haste. A rusted lantern hung from the ceiling, still swinging slightly as if someone had passed through moments before. He moved from bed to bed, inspecting each one. Under the third mattress he found another scrap of fabric, pink with a floral print. It matched the pattern on Emily's favorite pajama shirt. He took it and placed it gently in his bag. The video recorder in his other hand picked up flickers in the infrared, faint shapes, cold and still, on the far side of the room. He moved the light and saw a row of lockers, some opened, some closed. He approached the far wall and saw another map drawn in charcoal, this one more detailed than Emily's sketch. It showed a branching network of tunnels, each labeled with numbers or names. One tunnel was circled twice in heavy strokes and labeled with a single word, ascent. He traced the line with his finger and noted its direction. It led back toward the hatch, but not directly. It curved around something large, something labeled with 3 short marks, a triangle, a circle, and a line, the same symbols carved along the walls. He marked the location in his notebook and continued forward, determined to find the next connection. The corridor beyond the room narrowed again, this time into a steep downward passage carved directly into the floor was slick, and he was forced to slow his pace, bracing against the wall as he descended. The air grew colder, the silence heavier. He passed through another doorway and into a chamber where the ceiling arched overhead like a rib cage. The walls were smooth and curved, unlike the rough stone of the previous tunnels, and in the center of the floor there was a grate, round, iron, sealed. His flashlight revealed nothing through it, but when he placed his hand on the metal, it felt warm. Warmer than it should have. He lowered the gas meter through one of the gaps and waited. The screen blinked red, detecting heat and trace moisture. The heartbeat from the thermal scan had come from this place. He pulled back quickly and circled the room, looking for any sign of Emily. There was none. No personal items, no drawings, no words, just the grate. And beneath it, something alive. He sat down against the wall, breathing slowly, letting his thoughts settle. She had been here, her notebook, her map, her fabric, but she was not now. The tunnels were too old, too silent, too still. If she had escaped, she left clues behind. If she had not, she was deeper still. He knew he could not open the grate alone. He would need equipment, maybe others, maybe help. But help came with questions, and questions led to hesitation. He had to go back, not to stop, but to prepare. He stood, marked the location, and began the slow ascent back to the hatch, one step at a time, never once looking over his shoulder. The moment Liam reached the surface again, he was struck by how wrong the daylight looked compared to the stillness below. The forest no longer appeared peaceful or natural, but artificial, like a backdrop hiding something ancient and watchful beneath its surface. He sat at the base of a nearby tree, heart still racing, dragging in gulps of clean air as if returning from a dream too vivid to forget. The hatch remained behind him, closed but no longer sealed, and its presence felt heavier than before, like a mouth that had exhaled once and was now waiting to inhale again. Liam knew he could not return to that place empty. He needed answers, not guesses, and evidence, not speculation. Something was alive down there, and Emily had been part of it, whether by force or by choice he had yet to determine. But every sign pointed to her survival in those tunnels, at least for a time, and that knowledge alone shattered the version of the story the town had accepted for years. He spent the next day compiling everything he had discovered, organizing maps, notes, samples, and recordings into a private archive on his laptop. He encrypted the files, labeled them using codes only he understood, and printed several hard copies, which he hid in separate locations around his home. He knew from the reactions of the old ranger and the awed silence from local officials that some people might not want these secrets exposed. He thought of the way the search had been halted in the 1980s, the files buried, the testimonies erased. Someone or something had made an effort to keep Alder Creek's underground hidden, and Liam no longer believed it was just fear or superstition behind those choices. He began drafting a report to send anonymously to a journalist in a nearby city, not one who focused on crime or missing persons, but one known for long-form investigative work, stories that exposed corruption and buried truths. He did not include his name, but he included coordinates, maps, and footage, enough to prompt attention without giving away how deep he had gone. While scanning the drone footage one last time before sending the report, he noticed something he had previously dismissed as static interference. In the lower right corner of the infrared overlay, just before the drone had lost signal, there was movement, not the pulsing heat signature, but a separate figure, colder than its surroundings, humanlessness. He isolated the image, enhanced it as best he could, and compared it to a photo of Emily taken the year she vanished. The resemblance was not exact, but the posture, the narrow shoulders, and the length of the hair lined up far too well to ignore. He printed the still and taped it to his wall beside the hand-drawn map from her notebook. She was there, or had been, watching or waiting or warning. He no longer believed she was trapped beneath the forest, at least not in the way he had imagined. If she was still alive, she was either hiding or protecting something. The next morning, Liam returned to the site with a different purpose. He did not enter the hatch. Instead, he moved east through the woods to the spot where he had once noticed a metallic flash beneath a fallen tree during one of his earliest drone flights. That flash had been dismissed at the time, too far from the primary anomaly and lacking context. But now he understood the value of every outlier. Every inconsistency mattered. He found the tree easily and began digging through the soil and dead branches with his hands. After 10 minutes, his fingers struck something hard. He brushed the dirt away to reveal a metal case, rectangular with rusted hinges. He pried it open and inside found a stack of photographs, papers, and a small cassette recorder. The photographs were black and white, mostly showing children posed in front of wooded structures with no identifying features. The children looked pale and malnourished, their eyes unfocused, like they had been instructed not to smile. Some photos had dates written on the back, ranging from 1968 to 1983. One image showed a girl who bore an uncanny resemblance to Karina Holloway, the second known victim, and another of a girl who looked like a younger version of the woman June Caraway had once described in her notes. Liam opened the folded papers next. They were field notes, written by hand, signed only with the initials RB. The entries described behavioral patterns in isolated children, experiments in psychological resilience, and adjustments to environmental stressors. One page mentioned testing social hierarchy in darkness and nutritional deprivation. Another spoke of constructing loyalty through ritual and isolation. He read in growing horror as the pages revealed a pattern of systematic containment carried out over years. The notes were clinical, unemotional, focused not on punishment, but on observation. It was not cruelty for its own sake, but research, the kind that required control and secrecy. These children had not vanished randomly. They had been chosen or taken or groomed and kept below ground, not by one person, but by a group with structure and purpose. The final item in the box was the recorder. It had no label and looked broken, but when he returned home and connected it to his computer using a digital converter, he was able to extract audio. The voice that spoke was calm, male, possibly in his 40s, dictating data. The tape described chamber humidity, light levels, and stress responses. It mentioned Subject E by name, noting her adaptation rate as unusually high compared to previous cycles. "She prefers to lead the others." He paused the tape, stunned. Subject E was Emily, or at least that was how they had referred to her. They had studied her, not killed her, not lost her, but studied her. She had become a leader below ground, by their design or by her own strength. He played the next segment, which contained a short recording of a girl's voice reading from a book, something about light and shadows. The voice was muffled but unmistakably hers. He stopped the playback, closed his eyes, and exhaled slowly. She had lived. In the hours that followed, Liam contacted no one. He needed to think, to process what it meant that not only had Emily survived, but had been shaped by something far older and darker than the forest's reputation. A hidden group had operated beneath Alder Creek, experimenting on children, sealing away knowledge, and watching from the shadows. The people of the town had not merely forgotten these disappearances. They had been conditioned not to see them. He stared at the timeline on his wall, now populated with names, dates, images, and coordinates, and he knew the truth was too large for him alone. But if Emily was out there, if she was still alive, she might be the only one who knew how to stop it, or explain it, or destroy it. Liam knew the contents of the metal case had changed everything he thought he understood about Emily's disappearances and the others that came before her. What had started as a mystery about a vanishing girl had now revealed itself to be a network of calculated manipulation and control. The photographs, the field notes, and, most hauntingly, the recording of Emily's voice were no longer just evidence. They were a direct message from the past, an undeniable signal that this place had not been forgotten by those who built it, and certainly not by those who endured it. As he sat in his attic, surrounded by maps and pinned photographs and scattered notebooks, Liam realized he could no longer proceed alone. But involving the authorities risked everything. They had ignored the evidence for years, whether from ignorance or complicity he could not say. He needed a new strategy, one that could protect the information he had gathered and force the truth into the open without giving the operation time to vanish again. He created multiple digital copies of the tapes and notes, uploaded them to encrypted cloud drives, and scheduled their release to several journalists and researchers if his access went dark. Then he turned his focus back to the tapes. He needed to understand what Emily had been through and what she might have become. He listened to the next set of recovering audio files with trembling hands. The voice of the male speaker returned, reporting behavioral updates on several subjects referred to only by letters. Subject E continued to exhibit leadership traits and had begun organizing others for daily tasks without prompting. Subject L resisted conditioning and was isolated. The recordings were cold, methodical, and terrifying in their detachment from the reality of what they described. Children were being treated like experiments, cataloged, analyzed, and discarded. But then the tone shifted. A file labeled Session 42 broke from the pattern. It began with static and then a burst of rapid footsteps and muffled breathing. The voice that followed was not the calm male researcher, but a girl whispering rapidly into the microphone. "They're asleep. I have 3 minutes. If you find this, we're trying. We found the first shaft behind the west wall. The air is colder there and it leads upward. We don't know how far, but we're going. I have the map. I have the names. They won't take us again." She paused and then added, "We left signs. You have to follow the circles." Then the recording cut to static again. Liam played the message over and over, each time mapping the phrases to what he had already discovered underground. The west wall must refer to the chamber beyond the beds. The ascent tunnel, drawn on the charcoal map, made sense now. It was not an access point created by the captors, but a hidden path discovered by the captives. Emily had found a way out. She and others had organized a plan, left markers, and tried to escape. The circles she mentioned began to appear in his memory. He had seen them, faint carvings near the base of certain door frames, intersecting lines on old beams, chalk marks beside entryways. He had assumed they were symbols from the original builders, but now he understood. They were trail signs, not for the watchers, but for the watched. He gathered his gear and prepared for another descent, this time not to explore, but to follow. He returned to the hatch under cover of night, wearing a backpack packed with food, water, light sources, spare batteries, the infrared camera, and a journal to record his steps. The forest was quiet as always, the silence no longer unnerving but expected, as if the trees had resigned themselves to what lay beneath them. He opened the hatch and climbed down slowly, retracing his path through the tunnel to the bedding chamber. There he stopped and turned his light to the west wall. The symbols were clearer now. A pattern of 3 circles nested within each other had been scratched low onto the stone. He placed his palm beside it, then began feeling the wall until he found a section where the stone gave slightly under pressure. A click echoed faintly, and a narrow panel swung inward, revealing a crawlspace barely wide enough to pass through. Liam entered the shaft, crawling on elbows and knees, dragging his pack behind him. The tunnel sloped gently upward and grew colder with each foot of progress. The air tasted stale but not dangerous. After several minutes, he emerged into a vertical shaft where a crude ladder made of knotted rope and wood planks hung against the stone. He tested the first rung and began climbing. The ascent took him into another series of chambers, each smaller and less refined than the last. These were not part of the original structure. They had been dug out by hand or repurposed from natural formations. On the walls, he saw more symbols, circles, arrows, names. One name stopped him cold. M scrawled in chalk beside a narrow split in the rock. He followed the direction of the mark and entered a chamber filled with scattered debris, makeshift tools, torn cloth, burned-out candles, and in the corner a small hand mirror cracked down the middle. He lifted it and saw initials etched into the back, E.S. His breath caught. She had been here, not years ago, but recently enough for the candles to still bear the faint scent of wax. He moved deeper into the chamber and found another opening leading downward. It spiraled like a natural cave, narrowing in places, opening wide in others. At the bottom he entered a hallway supported by wooden beams. On one beam, carved into the soft wood, were the names of at least 10 children, some crossed out, others underlined. M was not crossed out. It was circled. Liam knew he was close. He pushed forward into a final chamber, larger than any he had seen. The air was warmer again, dense with moisture. The ground beneath his feet was soft, covered in moss that had no business growing underground. And then he saw it. A series of sleeping mats arranged in a circle, long abandoned but undisturbed. In the center was a pile of belongings, clothes, books, a cracked radio, and resting on top was a camera, a small camcorder with a battery pack still attached. He powered it on. To his astonishment, it worked. There was one video stored. He played it. The screen lit up and showed a dim room. Several children stood around a table whispering. Emily stood at the center, holding a piece of paper and speaking directly to the camera. "If you found this, we're gone. We got out. We followed the shaft all the way to the exit above the quarry. It's dangerous. Don't stay. They're still listening." Her eyes shifted off screen. "Tell Liam I waited. He'll understand." Then the feed ended. Liam sat in stunned silence. She had escaped. She had survived. She had left behind proof. And she had spoken his name. He clutched the camera to his chest, tears streaming down his face for the first time in years. She had lived, she had fought, she had warned, and now it was his turn to make sure no one forgot again. Liam returned from the tunnels with the camera pressed tightly to his chest and the image of Emily's face still glowing in his mind like a beacon in the dark. Her voice echoed louder than the forest that swallowed all other sounds. She had survived. She had escaped. And she had waited for him. That sentence looped again and again in his memory until it burned a hole through every fear and every hesitation he had clung to in the years since she vanished. She had spoken his name, not in past tense, not as a lost memory, but as someone she still believed might find her. The recording had mentioned an exit near the quarry, and now that single location burned in his thoughts with such intensity that nothing else mattered. He cross-referenced Old Town maps, geological surveys, and topographical images until he found the area north of the forest where the ground dropped suddenly into a disused quarry surrounded by chain-link fencing and warning signs. The site had been closed for years due to erosion concerns and frequent small landslides. But if Emily had used it as a way out, it had to be more than a geological feature. It was a door disguised as danger, and Liam knew that if she had gone that way, someone else might too. He prepared a final search. This time he packed not just to explore, but to stay longer if needed. He brought a tent, extra food, water, and multiple cameras. He included a power bank and printed maps, and several copies of Emily's photograph with her name and the words, "Your family is still looking," written beneath. The next morning he set out before dawn. The trail was overgrown and the warning signs hung crooked on rusted posts, but the ground still bore traces of human movement. Branches bent in unnatural ways, footprints that had been compressed into dry earth and had never fully vanished. The quarry itself loomed like a broken mouth in the land, wide and hollow and filled with collapsed stone and wild weeds. Liam scanned the perimeter with his drone, hoping for any sign of movement, but the images came back empty. He circled the outer ridge and found a narrow crevice behind a fallen slab of concrete that had once been part of the quarry's machinery foundation. The gap was just wide enough for a person to squeeze through. His flashlight beam disappeared into blackness. He crawled inside. The tunnel behind the crevice was not long, but it twisted sharply before opening into a small chamber with damp walls and marks scratched into the stone. He saw the circles again, the same ones Emily had described. He followed them as they led him up a tight path that climbed through narrow openings and sharp rock turns. The air was stale but breathable. Eventually he reached a junction where the passage split in two. One path sloped down sharply, the other curved upward toward faint light. He paused, listening. Then he heard it. A shuffle, a breath, a presence. He raised his light slowly and called out softly into the passage above. Silence answered first, then a voice. Quiet, fragile, and entirely real. "Who are you?" He answered his name gently and waited. More shuffling followed, then a second voice, lower and protective. Then, footsteps. From the shadows emerged a figure. Female, thin, eyes wide but not fearful. She was older now, taller than he remembered, more angular in her face, but her eyes were unmistakable. Emily. She stood still, staring at him as if trying to prove he was not just another illusion. He dropped his light and raised his hand slowly, showing he carried no weapon, only the camera she had left and a folded photo of them as children. Her eyes filled and she stepped forward, trembling. He whispered, "I found your map." She nodded and said, "I waited." Then she collapsed into his arms and sobbed without sound. Behind her came two others, a boy perhaps 13 with a deep scar above his left brow and a girl of about 10 holding tightly to his hand. They looked exhausted but alert. Liam helped them all outside, through the crevice into the pale morning light. Emily winced at the brightness, and the others shielded their faces. They had not seen the sky in what seemed like years. He set up the tent and gave them food and water. They ate quietly, eyes constantly scanning the trees. Eventually, Emily began to talk. She told him that after the escape attempt shown in the video, she and the others had reached the quarry exit, but only she and the two children behind her had made it through. The others had been captured again, dragged back into the tunnels by men who no longer wore uniforms, but masks carved from wood. Emily and the two had hidden in natural cave systems, too narrow for pursuit, and survived by collecting rainwater and rationing old food from storage rooms they found deeper underground. She had left the camera on purpose as a signal, hoping one day Liam would trace it back. She said they had never stopped watching, that even above ground, someone came through the forest every week. Silent figures who checked the hatch and scanned the area as if waiting for someone to return. Liam listened without interrupting. His hands trembled with every new detail, but he kept writing, recording every word. These were not just survivors, they were witnesses. They were proof, and they were in danger. That night he moved them all farther from the quarry into a remote cabin owned by an old friend of his grandfather. It had no serve service and no road signs. There they slept on real beds for the first time in years. The next morning, Liam activated the timed uploads of the files and forwarded the video of Emily to the journalist he had prepared. He included the exact location of the hatch and the quarry and photographs of the carvings. Then he shut off his phone and waited. 3 days later, the story broke. National media picked it up. The footage went viral. Experts confirmed the voice on the tape matched Emily's childhood recordings. Authorities launched an investigation. The hatch was found and sealed. The tunnels below were mapped and declared off-limits until a full review could be conducted. Search teams returned and found traces of the rituals described in the journals: bones, symbols, clothes, and worst of all, a sealed door behind the grate that no one could open. But by then, Emily and the 2 children had been placed under protective care. They spoke to investigators, they named names, and in quiet rooms across the country, a chain of arrests began. Doctors, scientists, property managers, people who had once visited Alder Creek for reasons no one questioned. The network that had stolen children for decades was finally exposed. The town changed. The forest was fenced off and declared a restricted zone. Liam gave one interview and then disappeared from public view. He visited Emily once every week. They spoke not of the past, but of the quiet things that still lived in the corners of memory. She had not returned whole. But she had returned. The weeks that followed brought a strange silence that was no longer rooted in fear, but in the fragile weight of healing. Liam found himself walking the edge of the forest without dread for the first time in years. The trees still stood tall, and the mist still hovered low in the mornings, but something had shifted within the woods and within himself. The forest no longer felt like a predator, but like a graveyard of truths long buried and finally unearthed. He no longer heard the echo of Emily's last footsteps disappearing into the shadows. Now he heard her voice in full sentences, spoken with clarity and purpose. She and the 2 survivors had been relocated under the care of trauma specialists, and Liam had chosen not to follow them beyond that final meeting. They needed space to rebuild, and the world needed time to understand what had been revealed. His job was done, but the echoes of it would remain in the soil and in the walls of every hidden room beneath Alder Creek. The investigation had grown into something larger than he could have imagined. It turned out that the underground facility beneath the forest was only one of several across the country. Each had been built with precision and hidden within state or private land protected by outdated permits and legal loopholes. The arrests that followed came quietly. The people taken into custody were not masked figures or shadowy monsters, but men and women with polished careers and respectable lives. The truth was not that evil had worn a disguise. It was that no one had been willing to look for it in plain sight. The children, taken over the decades, had been erased from records through forged documents and silenced families. But now those records were being restored. Names long forgotten were being carved into stone, memorials not to grieve alone, but to remind the world that silence was a choice. Liam was asked to speak at one of the first public memorials held in Alder Creek. He declined the podium, but agreed to sit in the front row with his parents, who now held each other with the quiet bond of those who had endured the deepest kind of pain. Emily's name was the first read aloud that morning, followed by the names of Karina Holloway and April Boone and the others who had never come home. Some had perished underground, some had escaped and vanished, some were never found at all. But the reading of their names was not a eulogy. It was a declaration that they had existed, that they had been wronged, and that they would be forgotten no more. When the ceremony ended, Liam remained seated long after the others had gone. He looked toward the tree line where the forest began and imagined Emily standing there at 13 years old, notebook in hand, looking for a white deer or a new species of fern or a reason to explore what lay beyond what others feared. He smiled softly and whispered that he was sorry for not stopping her, but more than that, he was proud of her for surviving. He did not need to see her again to understand that her life would now be measured not by what was taken from her, but by what she refused to let die within herself. The cabin where Liam had once sheltered Emily and the children was later donated to a foundation supporting recovered youth from trauma-based captivity. It became a quiet place where survivors could write or paint or sit with others who needed no explanation. Inside the cabin, the only decoration was a single framed photograph of 3 children sitting in sunlight, their eyes closed, their shoulders barely touching, and their faces relaxed for the first time in years. Beside the photo hung a small plaque that read, "They came from silence, but left behind a voice." Years passed. The forest changed slowly. New growth filled the cleared trails, and the hatch was sealed in concrete and buried. The land above it was marked only with a single stone, with no words carved into it, because none were needed. Liam went on to study environmental sciences, not because he wanted to understand the forest better, but because he had learned how dangerous ignorance could be. He never spoke publicly about what he had found, except once in a classroom when a student asked why he had a scar on his hand that looked like a rope burn. He smiled and said, "Sometimes, to find what matters most, you have to be willing to crawl through the dark." Emily never returned to Alder Creek, but she wrote Liam 1 letter each year on the date she disappeared. She never signed her full name. She never wrote about the tunnels or the cameras or the things they had seen. She wrote about the stars and the way the sky changes in winter, and about birds that do not migrate but stay behind to protect the nests others forget. He kept every letter in a box beneath his bed. He never replied, not because he did not want to, but because he believed that part of their story had found its closure and it deserved to rest without being rewritten. The message was never in the horror they uncovered, but in the quiet way they chose to live after it. Not in fear, not in bitterness, but in truth. One autumn morning, many years later, Liam stood at the edge of the forest again, older now, quieter, but still listening. The trees swayed gently, and somewhere in the canopy had words sang without warning. He looked down at the moss-covered ground and whispered thank you to a sister who had once vanished, not because she was brave enough to follow a path no one else would. He turned and walked away from the forest one last time, not because it was over, but because the story now belonged to the world and not just to him. The silence that had once haunted Alder Creek was broken, and in its place stood something stronger. Memory, accountability, hope. If this story moved you, tap like and subscribe so we can bring more untold truths to light. What did you think about Emily's journey and Liam's discovery? Did any part surprise you? Let us know in the comments and tell us where you're watching from. We read every one.